seismic shift in South America. Brazil elects a far-right president for the first time in 3 decades. Why are many concerned for the country's future? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Jair Bolsonaro. Pinochet should have killed more people. That's just one of the many outrageous statements made by Brazil's new president. After a divisive campaign filled with corruption allegations and even a stabbing, Jair Bolsonaro stood victorious. It was the culmination of an almost 30-year journey from when he left the military to enter politics. He served 7 terms as a congressman, marked by violent rhetoric, including calling for the assassination of the elected president. Now he's the first non-centrist or leftist leader since the end of Brazil's military dictatorship more than 3 decades ago. And while some are jubilant, others, both in and out of the country, are very worried about where Bolsonaro will take Brazil. TRT World's Edis Tianshan reports from Rio de Janeiro.
Brazil has just taken a sharp turn to the right in its most drastic political transition since democracy was re-established 3 decades ago. 55% of Brazil's voters in the runoff chose Jair Bolsonaro as their new president, ending 14 years of rule by the center-left.
Eram os 3 principais partidos.
The Brazilian political system of the last 30 years was defeated. This political system, which had 3 major parties, Bolsonaro does not have the support of any of these parties. So this is a sign that the political system is in transformation.
Há uma derrota do centro político.
The incoming president is known as the Trump of the Tropics. His campaign slogan, Brazil First, echoes the US president's foreign policy. And Bolsonaro's victory speech was about Brazil's standing in the world.
Libertaremos o Brasil.
We will liberate Brazil and its foreign ministry from the ideology of its international relations that it has subjected Brazil to in recent years. We will restore international respect for our dear Brazil.
Coming from a small conservative party, Bolsonaro's popularity grew rapidly in response to the apparent failure of the established political parties. Largely based on social media, his campaign to fight crime and corruption drew millions of supporters. Brazil has been hit by a series of corruption scandals known as Lava Jato, or car wash. It's led to the impeachment of the former president Dilma Rousseff and the arrest of her predecessor Lula da Silva, a leader who once enjoyed an 80% approval rating. Bolsonaro emerged at the right time, riding the wave of the left's failures and the frustrations of the upper middle class. But for the most vulnerable Brazilians who depend on the policies of the Workers' Party, the apparent demise of the left is of great concern. Cleide lives in a slum outside Sao Paulo. She collects rubbish to make money, but can hardly afford to meet any of their basic needs, and certainly not the medicine she, her husband and her younger son need to fight HIV. For nearly 5 years, she's received social benefits from the state.
My vote is for Haddad, no matter what, because I know he would continue on giving these benefits to us who need it. And Bolsonaro, the only thing he will do is take from us what we don't have.
Bolsonaro said during his campaign that he wouldn't change social programs, but his economic position so far is all about the free market. With the world's highest number of murders, Brazil has long been one of the most dangerous places to live. In the suburbs of Rio de Janeiro, Fernando Correa's family has experienced many threats that have become all too common in this city. And on the day of this interview, while Fernando's father was on his way to work, he was threatened by a masked gunman. But they say it wasn't nearly as bad as the time they both were kidnapped.
When we leave the house, we're always scared, we're always worried. I don't leave the house at night anymore, for longer trips, particularly with kids. And in the daytime, you go out. If you see a traffic jam, you already think it's a shootout, it's a holdup.
This is why Fernanda voted for Bolsonaro, the former military captain who promised to crush organized crime by any means.
I want a civilian and military police force that's going to shoot to kill.
Eloise lives in the City of God, an infamous slum outside Rio de Janeiro. It's still controlled by gangs selling guns and drugs.
The military intervention is very aggressive when it comes in, and with Bolsonaro it's going to be even more aggressive. Those who live in the slums, black and the poor, are seen as criminals, so for us it's not going to be good.
Bolsonaro is expected to have drastically different policies than his predecessors. It's hard to predict the mark he will leave on Brazil, but it's evident its people will remain highly polarized. It is Tianshan, Rio de Janeiro, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Boston by Bolsonaro supporter Julio Moraes. He's the founder of the NGO, the Public Administration Institute. In New York, we have Bolsonaro critic Miriam Marques. She's the co-founder of Defend Democracy in Brazil. And completing our panel from Washington is Elcio Santana. He's a senior associate at the Center for Strategic Studies. I thank you all for joining us. Miriam, let me begin with you. How do you feel about Bolsonaro being your president?
I feel, of course I feel sad as someone who I'm an activist for democracy in Brazil. I feel sad, but at the same time I feel strong. I feel sad for the Brazilian people because what will coming, what we expected from now, I think it's a very dark times for Brazilian democracy and for Brazilian people, especially the vulnerable people, the indigenous, the poor, the minorities, LGBT people, women, poor people who live in the slums, in the favelas, and in the countryside of Brazil. I am sad, but at the same time, I'm courageous because, we will resist that.
So tell me, Miriam, if this is such a dark time for Brazil, why did 55% of Brazilians vote for him in that runoff?
That's a good question. We are not talking about free elections in a way. When we talk about Brazil, we didn't have yesterday free, democratic, no problematic at all elections. Everybody knows, and your television channel is reporting a lot about Brazil recently. Since the coup d'etat in 2016, and then through all that happened on the way, we are talking about elections that, for instance, we had the imprisonment of Lula da Silva that was the front runner before for no reason, with no proof. We also talking about a fraudulent election that we know, for instance, in many ways, especially everybody saw in the last period, the invasion of people's identities on Facebook, and then multi-million dollars campaign on WhatsApp, where fake news, the most horrendous, the most terrible fake news about our candidate, Fernando Haddad, inundated people's cell phones in Brazil. We are talking also about, evangelical support on all over in Brazil, channels, radios, television. So it was not at all fair elections in Brazil.
And that's an argument we've heard from the other side quite often over the past few months. Those who would have voted for Lula if he was allowed to run, and then who voted for Haddad, but they lost. Julio, your candidate won. For many others, they see the president as a bigoted, narrow-minded populist who's taking Brazil down a dark path. Tell me why you see it differently.
I see different. Well, thanks for having me here. I see different. The majority of the people went to the poll and spoke the voice. They choose Bolsonaro as a new president. Bolsonaro brings hope, bring a new change in Brazilian history. Right now, I see people on the street. There was people's campaign. People went out. People invest their time so they make sure we bring a change to Brazil. So right now, we expect Bolsonaro to do a good administration. He's going to be the president for all Brazilians, not only for the people that vote for him, the 55% of the people, but the entire Brazilian population.
Elcio Santana, when we look at the trajectory politically in Brazil, there were 4 successive victories for the left, whether through Lula or Dilma, and suddenly everything imploded for them. Was this less about a Bolsonaro victory on the right and more about a leftist implosion and a leftist loss?
I think neither one. I think I just finished an article that will be published next week, and in which I say that the title is "What You See Is Not What You Get." So you see a presidential election, and what you get is actually the change of the Constitution in 1988 that sort of sealed the social pact, the Brazilian society, after 21 years of military dictatorship. Since then, the country has moved to a more conservative mood, judging by the people that have been elected. So Bolsonaro is not a black swan in the sense that Taleb calls a low probability event. I mean, Bolsonaro is in the making for quite a long time, and if it was not Bolsonaro, there will be another right-wing candidate who would gather some votes. Bolsonaro is an accident as an individual, but as a trend, there was a conservative movement in Brazilian society toward the right, if you want.
Okay, that's interesting.
So,
Miriam,
it's
interesting. If you'd allow me, let me just ask Miriam how she feels about that. That's been the trend, that Brazil, the Brazilian populace is going more and more conservative. And it was a perfect storm. You have corruption scandals. Yes, you might call it a coup against Dilma, but for many people, Operation Car Wash and everything else meant that they were fed up with the current politicians and they wanted somebody different. They chose somebody with what they call traditional values. That happened to be Bolsonaro. Address that for me.
First of all, I want to say that it's not, I agree there is a trend, a global trend to the right, let's say, but also there is a global trend on manipulation on elections for the extreme right with Steve Bannon and his company, right, backing from starting Texas and then the United States, and then now he's in the United States. He did a kind of a test on Brazil of his methods, right? Okay, but I want to disagree a little bit with, oh, there is a tendency to the right. Let's remember that the Workers' Party, Fernando Haddad, got 31 million votes in Brazil. I'm talking about 31, when we talk about the votes to the left in Brazil, to Fernando Haddad, we are talking about a very qualified votes. We are talking about at least, I would say, at least half or more of that are activists, are people in associations, are people in unions, in all kinds of civil society organizations. So yes, there is this trend in Brazil because let's remember, we don't live in a kind of a democracy in Brazil. Let's talk about the media in Brazil, right? We have only one channel, global television, that is in all houses, all record televisions. They are talking against the Workers' Party, against the left, every single minute you call on them, all right? We are talking also about you say about car wash, let's say the truth. Car wash is a kind of, at least, controversial operation because a lot of politicians that were much more involved with much more proof against them, they never touch about by the car wash operation.
Okay, so putting all of that aside, Julio, why should the world respect or the world look for encouraging signs from someone who admired a military dictatorship and admired Pinochet? Tell me why.
Because that's democracy. That's what people spoke for. That's why we have election, all right? Just to go towards Marianne said, I disagree with her because for the Works Party and its associate or ally, the only democracy is the democracy they support. If they don't get elected, that's not a democracy. They support Maduro in Venezuela, and they call a democracy, and they call Bolsonaro a dictator without the guy even taking office yet. You know what I'm saying? So there's like controversial what Marianne said in the Works Party defend too. They defend the dictatorship in other countries, but in our country, when we have democracy and they lose, then we become a dictator and our elections become fraud.
Miriam?
Well, he says not a dictatorship. we don't need to put words in Bolsonaro's mouth. He himself says about that. He said very clear a few days before the elections that he will stop this crying of the black people, of this and that. He say his vice president is a general. There was threats by high people in the arms saying that now is the end of the Reds, that let's go. He himself, in his word, he invite people to go after every single red person in Brazil, minorities, homosexuals. Yes, I'm very afraid about democracy in Brazil. I would be not surprised if Bolsonaro acts soon will be like ending the closing the Congress. He will go after the judiciary. I won't be surprised if very, very bad things to our democracy will happen.
Right, and those comments about black people specifically, he said, what historic debt do we have with blacks? I never enslaved them. The Portuguese never set foot in Africa. The blacks were delivered by blacks. That was on July 30th, 2018. Elcio, as we look at what he has on the menu in terms of leading, there's talk of the Amazon and the environment, social issues, economic issues, crime and security and so forth. What's his top priority, do you think?
Well, that's where the big problems are. I mean, let me just go back a step here and says that if the candidate against Bolsonaro would have been Ciro Gomes or Alckmin or any other, Bolsonaro would have lost. Bolsonaro won because part of the voters didn't want to have the PT. And we can discuss why, is that correct, is not correct, but the fact is, part of the people that voted in Bolsonaro did not vote in Bolsonaro, voted not to have the PT again. And that's controversial, we can debate that, but if it had been Ciro or Alckmin, so I'm sort of nuanced the trend that I have pointed out before, but let me just mention the question that you had asked. I mean, Bolsonaro didn't have, he had a lot of proposals, but the proposals were basically inconsistent. He ran on some outrageous, in my point of view, declarations that captured the imagination of some people.
It's fascinating times for Brazil and all of Latin America. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, the leaders of Turkey, Russia, Germany and France meet in Istanbul to try and end the war in Syria. But was the summit a success? Geneva, Astana, Sochi and now Istanbul. Finding a solution to the Syrian war has so far proved elusive. But the leaders of Turkey, Russia, France and Germany met this weekend hoping to do just that. It was the first time this group of nations had all been at the same table. But there was no room for Iran or the United States, both key players in the conflict. After hours of talks, the quartet appealed for a political solution, calling for the draft of a new Syrian constitution, which would eventually lead to free and fair elections. So, was this a major breakthrough? We'll debate that in a moment, but first, here's Sandra Gatman.
Expectations were low that another summit about Syria's future, without the presence of the Syrians, was going to result in a breakthrough. But the four leaders from Germany, France, Turkey and Russia tried something new in Istanbul. Until now, two main groups have been trying to broker peace in Syria. The so-called Geneva process includes the UN, the US and the European Union. And the Astana process involves Turkey, Russia and Iran. These latest talks hosted in Istanbul were a kind of merger, just without Washington and Tehran. The leaders mainly agreed on the need to create a 150-member committee to draft a new constitution for Syria by the end of this year.
Anayasa Komitesi'nin kuruluş sürecinin en kısa sürede şartları gözeterek temennimiz odur ki yıl sonu itibariyle tamamlanması çağrısında bulunduk.
Die ist aber notwendig, damit dann dieser politische Prozess, an dessen Ende Wahlen stehen müssen, freie Wahlen, zu denen alle Syrer Zugang haben, auch die in der Diaspora, damit ein solcher Prozess überhaupt in Gang kommt.
Initiating any political process in Syria is especially important for Turkey and Europe. They've taken in millions of Syrian refugees who've waited years to see signs of stability and an end to fighting back home.
It would give the people in Syria, either in Syria at the moment or those who had to leave their homelands, it would give them a clear perspective to feel included. It is something to look forward to. If even this is postponed indefinitely, what kind of state would it be? What kind of political structure would it be? Could catastrophes happen again? You need to have a clear legal framework.
But the Syrian regime isn't making it easy. Over the weekend, the Syrian regime rejected the United Nations having a role in selecting a third of the committee's members.
Basically, Minister Moallem did not accept a role for the UN in general in identifying or selecting the middle third list.
Another far more pressing concern is Syria's northern province of Idlib. It's the last stronghold for Syrian rebels who the regime sees as extremist militants. Turkey and Russia brokered a deal in September to create a buffer zone and halt a military offensive on Idlib that could have led to a humanitarian disaster. Nearly 3 million Syrians, many already displaced from other war-torn areas, would be forced to flee again. But Russia, who's been launching airstrikes in Idlib, suggested there was more to do there.
Несмотря на то, что уровень насилия в Сирии существенно снижен, немаловажной задачей остается ликвидация всех скопившихся там радикальных элементов. Нельзя допустить, чтобы получившие боевой опыт бандиты продолжали преступную деятельность, создавали в наших странах.
There's a faint feeling of optimism surrounding Syrian peace talks these days. A hope that international players are inching closer to finding a solution that will wrap up this nearly 8-year-long conflict. The summit here in Istanbul was certainly a step in that direction, but we're still a very long way off from ending the fighting on the ground for good. That needs a political solution that's palatable for everyone, not just the 4 leaders meeting here in Istanbul.
And despite all the emphasis on a Syrian-led solution, getting the country's warring sides to talk has been near impossible. Skepticism remains over how much peace can be pushed along if the divisive question of Bashar al-Assad's future as the regime's leader continues to be avoided. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, we're joined here in the studio by Hadi al-Bahra. He's a member of the Opposition Syrian Negotiations Commission. In Berlin, we have Matthew Carniching. He's the chief correspondent in Europe for Politico. In Grenoble, France, we have François Bourgat, a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. In Moscow is Sergei Markov, a political analyst and former Kremlin advisor. And finally, also with me here in the studio is the head of TRT Arabic, Rasul Serdar Atash. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Hadi al-Bahra, let me start with you. We had all these powers talking about Syrians, but no Syrians. So as a Syrian in opposition to Assad, as you watched what was unfolding on Saturday, did you feel something good came out of it?
I think we can call it a success. The summit could be named the summit of consensus, where the 4 countries successful in reaching major understanding and common point of interest, where they addressed objectively and they have reached a common plan to solving these issues. Some of them, like Russia, had to adjust its position, and especially on the refugees issues and reconstruction issues. Germany has addressed more strongly with Turkey about the political resolution of the crisis and the establishment of the Constitutional Committee. So by all standards, we can say, by words, by the closing statement, it's a successful consensus summit. But we will wait and see if we can transpose these words into actions on the ground in the near future.
Sergei Markov, we hear from Hadi al-Bahra that Russia had to adjust some of its positions here in order to gain consensus. Do you agree with that, that Russia had to adjust more than the others had to adjust to Russia?
I think a lot of other colleagues believe that Russia has too much. I'm sorry. Maybe another country has some more. For example, France and Germany should talk about the peace solution, political solution, a few years before, but not just now. But let's move to the result of the summit. I think the main positive result is formation of political subject, political actor, which is now these four, Turkey, Russia, France, and Germany. These four will play for the transmission Syria from the war to the peace. Previous period, most important role have been played by Troika, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and their role was to finish the war, and they almost did it. Now these four will have role to start the peace. First, they have been created.
Okay, you're encouraged by it. Okay. Okay, now let me bring in Resul Serdar. Resul, Turkey taking the lead here, inviting everybody to Istanbul. After Saturday, after that final communique where we saw President Erdogan with the other leaders, did it feel like it was a success, that this is moving forward?
It is a success, but at the end of the day, we should remember that the Geneva talks, there has been 7, 8 talks there, and it was not a successful. So many of the parties, related parties, were feeling that it is just waste of the time. But starting with Astana and Sochi process, and now in Istanbul, a new summit that has been extended to the largest European actors as well, I think it's a success. Symbolically, it's a success as well. When you look at the ending result or the communique of the summit, you will see that mostly it is dominated by the narrative of Turkey and Russia. 85% was dominated by Russia and Turkey. First, the first stress on the national sovereignty, which was insisted by Russia, and the territorial integrity of Syria, which was a very much sensible issue for Turkey. It was a success. So France and Germany, in this case, were here mostly for 2 reasons. First, humanitarian issues, mostly I will say refugees, because mostly Germany, but to a certain extent France as well, they have to tackle with this issue, because now they are the engines of the European Union. And the second reason for them of being here, or the importance of them being here, was, I will say, symbolically, it was important to extend the legitimacy of the summit. France and Germany had a huge contribution to this summit.
Okay, so Francois, we were here on Saturday watching it unfold, and we spoke about it afterwards. You've had some time to think about it now, a couple days on. Francois, what do you think? What was the main reason for Emmanuel Macron being here? Was it terrorism and stopping terrorism? Was it the refugee crisis, or was it extending French soft power and also adding legitimacy to the process?
Well, I saw 3 of them. I shall repeat the words of a French diplomat who said that before all, Francis wanted to be back in the game, even with very weak cards. So France wanted to, again, participate in finding the solution. For which reasons? You have said it. One is the migrant dimension of the crisis. The second one, which has been very artificially the main one for the French and many Europeans, is the so-called terrorism or extreme fringe of the Syrian crisis. So this is all part of this new step. Now, allow me to say why this has been a success before I will probably lower my optimism. It has been a success because it has upheld the agreement on Idlib. And Idlib, in the history, in the recent history of the crisis, it is the very first time that something else than a mere continuum in the military process is on the table. It is the first time that some politics is back in the tool, among the tools of the players. So for this reason, it is important. Now we will probably later on ask me if I am confident in the political solution. I am not. I will say it later.
Okay, well, you've asked the question for me, and you're not confident. That's fascinating. Matthew Carniching, we come to you on an interesting day because we've just got news, obviously, that Angela Merkel will be stepping down as party chairman of her party, the CDU. From 2021, it is certain that she will not be chancellor in Germany. A lot of people see the situation in Syria and its aftermath and the refugee crisis as having affected her deeply domestically. So let me then ask you, Matthew, was Angela Merkel in Istanbul for domestic or international purposes?
I think she was there for international purposes because she's been keeping a close eye on what's happening in Syria and particularly in Idlib recently. And this is exactly the kind of meeting, the kind of dialogue that Merkel likes to engage in internationally. She never shies away from meeting with world leaders in conflict zones. So I think this is very much in keeping with what has been her international policies since she's been chancellor. If you look at what she's done in the Ukraine, the Minsk agreements and so forth, it's very similar. Unfortunately, often these dialogue sessions that she engages in don't result really in tangible results. And I would also argue that this was such a case that even though some of your guests now are saying this was a success, I think it's very difficult to describe this as a success from a Syrian vantage point. It might be a success from some of the viewpoints from the various capitals engaged in the talks, but certainly from a European's perspective, it can't be seen as a success at all.
Okay, so Hadi al-Bahra, take Matthew up on that. He's saying from a Syrian perspective, it can't really be a success. And he has a point in the sense that, okay, while there might be a ceasefire in Idlib, things might be paused for the moment, and there's good intentions, we're seeing nothing tangible moving forward right now. Should we not expect any more than what was achieved this weekend?
No, we can say partly he's correct in his statement, but we need to consider that two major players in this summit who are Russia and Turkey. Both of them, they have their forces on the ground in Syria. Both of them party to the agreement in Idlib, and both of them, they play a big role into the political solution of the crisis. So what we expect transferring these understanding and consensus reached by word in the closing statement into action in the upcoming meeting for the Astana group and later on with the small group which met today, I think, and coming out with the clear roadmap into implementation, the establishing of the Constitutional Committee and reactivating the Geneva talks.
Do you think all these people can get together in a Constitutional Committee before the end of the year?
I think the committee would be established. I don't know if Russia would be able to press enough on the Syrian regime to let them have active participation in it. But at the end, the regime has no way except to participate in this committee.
Yeah, talking about Russia, Sergei Markov, when we watched that press conference, it ultimately looked like consensus among three countries for sure, with Russia very loosely connected to everybody else. And I give you some examples. When it comes to Vladimir Putin saying, don't call them a regime, it's rude. They are the legitimate government of Syria. We have Emmanuel Macron saying the regime wants to retake control of the country. That won't happen again. Angela Merkel talking about Assad's chemical weapons use against his own people. Russia believes it was the other side that did the chemical weapons attack. With all of that in mind, is it rather just Russia representing Assad and the Iranians and that other side versus everybody else and pragmatically coming together because they want to stop the bloodshed?
I think Russia has an independent policy. Sometime it could be almost alone, but we don't have psychological problems because of this. We believe that sometime the right could be those who are alone, because another is crowd, which is under the pressure of some big chief connected with destabilization of the situation. And I think that was in the summit was some kind of bargaining and about what will happen in the post-war Syria. Turkey, France and Germany want to have political influence for the formation of the government of the post-war Syria, and Russia wants them to pay for economical recovering of Syria. And the discussion will be continued in the next meetings, and we know that the foreign ministers of all these four countries will meet very briefly to discuss specific steps. And I think this will be the key percent. What is first? Political influence for them and money then, or first they should pay money for recovering, or how to make it parallel and in harmony. It will be the point for discussion.
But,
of course,
Mr. Markov, certainly, let me come in here for a second. I want to ask you if there has been a shift on one particular issue. Up until now, Russia has been very fluid in its definition of who is a terrorist and who is a legitimate target for both Russian forces and Bashar al-Assad's regime forces. In the final communique, it says very clearly that they all agree that Daesh or ISIS and Al-Qaeda-linked militants, Nusra Front or HTS, whatever you want to call them, they are condemned and legitimate targets for everybody. But before that, the Russians even included the Free Syrian Army and others as legitimate targets. Is this now a shift that Russia agrees with everybody else that, okay, Al-Qaeda and Daesh, fine, those are extremists. Everybody else, they are legitimate rebels?
It's not exactly. I'm sorry, it's not like the students' answer on the exam about history, what already happened. Because those organizations, sometimes terrorist organizations can change their names, as, for example, Jabhat al-Nusra tried to do it. And at the same time, their behavior can be changed. Where, very clear, if they use military forces against civilians, if they're terrorists. If they're just fighting as soldiers, they're soldiers fighting for something else, and we can negotiate with them. Also, the ability to negotiate. We know that Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra not able to negotiate. Others possibly can. And it's about a blip.
Okay.
We come to agreement that from a blip zone, it will be not military attack. Those military groups who follow this agreement, they're not terrorists. Those who violated this agreement and sent some of the bombs or use artillery from those periods, they're terrorists.
Okay. Matthew, let me bring you in here and look at the German perspective here. No matter who's in charge in Germany, as we move forward, is there German appetite to get more involved in solving Syria? And is it on behalf of Germany or is it on behalf of the entire European Union?
Well, I think it would have to be an initiative, at least with France and representing the broader European Union. And that definitely seems to be the direction that German foreign policy is going generally. And on an issue as difficult as Syria, I think that the Germans would want to have as many other European countries on board with whatever they're doing there as possible. That said, I think that the German elites certainly recognize how important Syria is on the one hand. On the other hand, they also see that it's a very fraught, difficult situation, and there aren't any easy solutions. And this discussion here now about the Constitutional Committee, for example, there's no guarantee that that is actually going to happen or that it's going to produce any results. Just the opposite. It seems likely that that will not lead to anything, given the fact that Russia has little interest in having a real kind of constitution in Syria any more than Assad does. So this feels a little bit like a bit of a game, in particular on the part of the Russians, to kind of play for time and to negotiate to try and get a little bit of money out of the Europeans, maybe for reconstruction. But anybody who believes that this is going to end in some kind of a real constitutional reform in Syria, as long as Assad and the regime there is in power, I think is somewhat naive.
Hadi, are the Russians and is Assad just playing for time here?
For sure, this is the main strategy, but also we have a real situation on the ground that you cannot have a stable Syria without reaching a political resolution of the crisis. You cannot have reconstruction without having stabilization. You cannot have the refugees returning back to Syria without a stable and free country. All of these facts has been understood now by Russia, which tried to bypass all these points, and it failed. Until now, very few refugees came back to Syria. No countries agreed to start reconstruction inside Syria. So the odds is that Russia and the regime would be forced to go into talks for a political resolution of the crisis.
Political resolution, which includes Bashar al-Assad still being the president of Syria, would that be acceptable?
I think the Syrian people have said their word. They have their revolution. They want a new government, new leaders, and new future for Syria.
And Rasul Serdar Atash, what is Turkey's endgame here? What does Turkey want ultimately?
Basically, as I emphasized, Turkey's priority is the territorial integrity of Syria, which means basically it is a kind of policy against the PKK's offshot YPG, because YPG now, for the long term, I think is the real strategic threat for the Syrian territorial integrity. And Turkey is giving a huge importance over that and to stop this. There are some real suspects, or I would say doubts about the United States as well, United States Syrian over Syria as well, because some of the analysts and some of the policymakers also in Ankara, I think, are coming to a point to believe that the USA also for the long term is somehow planning a kind of federation in Syria, which will be a huge blow for Ankara. And I think Turkey, by focusing on this, by focusing on the territorial integrity of Syria, is basically trying to prevent this. Look, in Syrian scene, we have 4 real actors. All of the rest are, I will say, details. Turkey, Russia, Iran, and the USA. And everybody knows at the end of the day, when there is a table for the solution, these 4 parties are going to be the leading forces.
Let's say goodbye now to Matthew, Francois, and Sergey, and bring in 2 new guests. We spoke about the Iranians and the Americans. From Milan, we have Michael Pregent. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And from Tehran, we have Iranian affairs analyst Said Mustafa Hoshcheshim. Gentlemen, good to have you joining us on the Newsmakers. Michael Pregent, so
thank you for having me.
This weekend, the theory went, as far as the people I'd spoken to, the theory was that the US is not invited and not involved right now partly because of their naivety when it came to Syria. And ultimately, this Daesh first or ISIS first policy meant that the US had to play dumb about the geopolitics of the region and even sacrifice possibly its relationship with Turkey by going for this ISIS first policy by arming the YPG and so forth. Were the Americans left out because they just didn't get it anymore?
Well, I think we needed to develop a strategy. The Americans needed to have a strategy for Syria, and it's evolved, and it's actually went backwards, it's gone forwards. But this counter-ISIS strategy that's been the main focus in Turkey has been a problem, you're right. And one of the issues here is using the proxy forces to go into Sunni Arab areas. So using the YPG, the SDF, which is heavily commanded by the YPG, to go into a Sunni area such as Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and not build up a Sunni Arab force. One of the things we did during the surge in Iraq is we built static Sunni security forces to not only help us decimate al-Qaeda, but to protect their neighborhoods from Iranian-backed Shia militias. So we need to do something like that in Syria. So our new strategy now is to maintain cleared areas of ISIS, to keep ISIS from coming back, and to defeat the remaining pockets of ISIS. And then we have this counter-Iran strategy that's highly dependent on Russia helping us move Iran out when we know when we know Russia can't help us. So it looks like we don't have a strategy at this time, and we weren't even involved in these talks. It was Germany, France, Turkey, and Russia. Russia. And we weren't in it, and that's a problem. We need to be in the game. We need to be in the fight.
Okay. Mustafa Hoshcheshim, was Iran hurt by the fact that they weren't invited, or was Russia a suitable enough representative to pass on the message to the Iranians, because the two are mostly on the same side in backing Assad?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, as far as the issue of the refugees is concerned, the Europeans and Turkey are entitled to be concerned about developments in northwestern Syria, in Idlib, since any kind of development, positive or negative, could have repercussions for these countries. But down, I believe that the goal or objective pursued, especially by Ankara, has been reinvigorating its position by collecting support from the Europeans in its interactions with Iran and Russia under this the Astana talks. And when we speak of more support for Turkey in this regard, nothing could be more encouraging or could be a proper, better pretext than the refugee issue that could result from the Idlib situation. So I do believe that Turkey's main goal has been reinvigorating its position with regard to Iran and Russia under the Astana talks, of course, because Turks have more differences with these two, while Iran and Russia share, admittedly, they share more interests and they see more threat. They share more threats in Syria.
Right.
Therefore, in order to start some new balance in interactions within the Astana talks, I believe Turkey sought to bring up more support, and that's why they invited the Russians, to have them alone in front of several European nations that could exert pressure on Moscow with regard to the Syrian fight.
Hadi al-Bahra, let me ask you as a member of the Syrian opposition, explain the difference in how you see the Russian support of Assad versus the Iranian support of Assad and who you could actually deal with.
I could say the Iranians support Assad as a person, and their relation is concentrated and built with Syria through al-Assad family. While the Russians, they support the regime, the ruling regime in Syria. They are deeply in depth inside the regime institution in Syria. So their relation to the regime, it's not personal, it's more institution-wise. So this is why we find the difference in positions between the Iranian positions toward the crisis and the Russian position of the crisis.
Rasul Sardar, is Turkey fed up with the Americans?
I wouldn't say it's fed up with the Americans, but it's quite frustrated with the Americans because, as my colleague from the USA said, that we need a strategy. I think Ankara now believes that the USA has a strategy, and the strategy is basically to shift in this, the region from the nation states to the federations, and which is very much dangerous for Turkey as well. So I wouldn't say the USA lacks a policy, but that is a kind of policy that is continuing on, and Turkey is very much frustrated about that. On the other hand, Turkey is well aware of that as well. Turkey's alliance with the USA has been decades that they are there, and they have fought together on different fronts globally. And Turkey is well aware of that. If the USA is not at the table, there will not be a real solution as well. So I think on one hand, Turkey is frustrated with the USA's policy, but on the other hand, it knows that the USA has to be there, a very much constructive part of the solution as well.
We know that the US president has a lot on his mind. There's midterms coming up. There was an attack on a synagogue. There's the migrant caravan that he's been talking about and even hyping and so on. Once all of that ends, do you think Trump and even Secretary Mattis and others would accept others sorting out Syria without the US being fully involved?
Well, I think the last thing the president wants is to run in 2020 with ISIS resurgence in Iraq and Syria. So the U.S. is there to stay. It's whether or not the strategy expands. And now we have a counter-ISIS and counter-Iran strategy in Turkey. But one of the things we're looking at specifically is the return of refugees. And we know once you leave a country, it's roughly about 5% of refugees that ever want to come back. And one of the messages actually sent by the Air Force Director of Intelligence, Assad's Air Force Intelligence Director, said that there are 3.2 million Syrians on a terrorist list. And what that means is that there's 3 degrees of separation. So a father, son, and a grandson would be on this terrorist list as well. And it's a disincentive for refugees to come back to Syria. Now, one of the biggest things the United States has is its unshakable position not to pour money into areas that Iran, Russia, and Assad have destroyed. So Russia and Iran want reconstruction funds. They're not going to get them from the United States, and we're going to put pressure on our European allies not to provide that funding. One of the pawns that Russia, Iran, and Assad have are those 500,000 refugees in Syria, and that's one of the issues. Our biggest concern here is who's allowed to vote in an upcoming election that determines whether or not Assad stays. And what we're seeing now is that unless you're in Turkey, you're not going to be allowed to vote. And if you're one of the 6.1 million internally displaced Syrians, you will have to vote in the areas that you're from, and the regime, Iran and Russia, won't let you come back. So those are things we're looking at long term, but it's hard to look at those things and address them if you're not at the table, if you're not part of these meetings, and if you're relying on outside organizations that have not succeeded in the past to represent your positions.
Presumably, Mustafa Hoshcheshem, the Iranians prefer for the Americans not to be at the table?
Let me explain something in brief first. You know, as was mentioned in the program, there are now some small numbers of refugees that have started reverse flow and reverse, you know, they are coming back to the country from Europe to Turkey and Syria, and also from Lebanon to Syria. This happened after several years of fighting and victories for the Syrian army and its allies on the ground, and after they could prevail sovereignty over major population centers in the country except for Idlib. This shows us that once terrorism is uprooted and stability or relevant security and stability prevails over the country, then we could see the refugees coming back to the country. This should be done in Idlib as well. According to the Sochi agreement, the first major or the first phase of the military objectives was establishing a demilitarized zone in Idlib. And this major goal has been in trouble right now, according to dissident-affiliated reports like Syrian Observatory of Human Rights and others. There are daily reports stressing that internationally recognized terrorist groups like al-Nusra they have reinvigorated themselves in this demilitarized zone, and they are even launching attacks on Syrian army positions. Now, it's time for Turkey, I believe, to initiate a new strategy within the whole Syria and not just at Idlib. I believe Turkey needs to take a new step in order to strike a new deal or agreement with Iran and Russia in order to uproot the issue of the problem of terrorism, helping the Syrian army to do what has been mentioned in the Sochi agreement, that's
so far,
establishing the demilitarized zone.
What we heard from all the
Turkey
leaders,
and its allied militants
what we heard from all the leaders
in that zone
on the weekend was that despite some problems, the Idlib agreement is holding. What they agreed on in Sochi is holding, yes, despite some problems. So
it's holding, but the Russians are already making the statement that they need to separate the 10,000 designated terrorists, Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups, from the civilian population. And if they don't separate, then Russia's going to start conducting military operations. What's key here is that Turkey actually has military on the ground. And Russia's not willing to attack targets where they're actually putting Turkish troops in danger. So that is the wild card there. That's the pawn. But Russia's signaling that unless Jabhat al-Nusra somehow removes itself from the population, that it's willing to conduct military operations. And that's not going to happen.
Big question marks over HTS or Jabhat al-Nusra. For the moment, Idlib holds, and people are seeing it as a microcosm of how things can be better in the rest of the country. A lot at stake. War still rages for 7.5 years in Syria. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. I have to move on, but I thank you all, Hadi, Rasul, Mustafa, and Michael. Thanks again. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Turkey's nationalist party, the MHP, says it will no longer ally itself with the ruling AK party in upcoming elections. Is the governing coalition fracturing? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.